The situation currently taking place in Myanmar is abominable. There is no safety anywhere, and the world has all but turned its back on an entire people trying to claim their freedom and insist upon their human rights in the face of blatant evil and inhumanity. International media seems to have moved on to the next story, scarcely reporting on this one anymore, even as the horror continues. We at Insight Myanmar Podcast find this intolerable, and we stand behind the Burmese people and their courageous effort to live in dignity. This platform is dedicated to making sure that we keep the conversation going, while ensuring these voices continue to be heard. Today's guest is one of those voices, and I invite you to settle in and open up to what follows.
Welcome back, everyone. Today we have a returning guest. Matthew Arnold is here to help us work through and understand the very complicated and ever-changing situation in the northeast of Myanmar, where there have been quite a few developments over the last couple of months and indeed over the last couple of weeks. So before we deep dive into this very complicated topic, for those who missed our last interview with you, would you care to introduce yourself and your background?
Sure. My name is Matthew Arnold. By background, I've been an academic and an aid worker. Academic background, did my PhD at the London School of Economics. Mostly worked on strategic studies, looking at war in different parts of the world, particularly in what might be termed fragile states, or weak states like South Sudan, Afghanistan, Congo, etc. Most of my work as an aid worker, worked for the World Food Program for quite a while as an emergency aid worker in different parts of the world, and then as a more on the development side for quite a while with the Asia Foundation, mostly in Myanmar, where I wrapped up as the country rep. And then after that, worked on economic policy before the coup. And then since the coup, I've been doing conflict analysis on the ever evolving situation. So that's kind of an overview. In terms of specific interests, I mean, I'm very interested in tracking the conflict situation because this is a war, and when we talk about politics and the wider social situation, we always have to contextualize it within that very specific raw reality of war. So that's kind of my overarching interest.
Absolutely. And I think we're very fortunate to have someone who has a specific focus on this kind of nuts and bolts type of analysis, particularly in something this complicated. And it is quite complex. So let's look at the northeast of the country. We saw back on the 27th of October, Operation 1027 launched last year with the Three Brotherhood Alliance. And that pushed back the military aggressively. But we recently heard that China had brokered ceasefires between the military and the Brotherhood Alliance. Now that is a strange piece of information. So is it first of all true that China is getting involved and brokering ceasefires? And second of all, why would the Three Brotherhood Alliance consider a ceasefire if, by all accounts, they've been putting the pressure on the military very successfully over the last few months?
I mean, fundamentally, we have to reflect on the military situation, which is the Northern Alliance achieved its major objectives, which was taking Northern Shan. They took, all the major towns in Northern Shan except for Muse. Going further south would have been problematic from a political standpoint because it then gets into the wider politics of Shan State, especially with the wider with the Shan population. So I think from a military perspective, this was a Operation 1027 was a resounding success for the Northern Alliance. It was consequently a resounding defeat for the junta. The junta lost a huge amount of men, weapons, and territory, and then also the psychological blow of losing towns and the imagery of the junta suffering its biggest defeat in history on the China border, where almost 3,000 troops surrendered, six brigadier generals surrendered. But this was part of the overall situation, which was of military defeat for the junta. So the fact that there was a ceasefire, I mean, this wasn't to stop fighting per se. it was it was a face saving gesture for the junta because they had already lost so much of northern Shan. There was also a lot of pressure on the Northern Alliance from China to do so. I think we have to acknowledge that. Um, there's also the reality that in all of this, we shouldn't be too obsessed with the notion of ceasefires. Actually, there's a lot of nuance and a spectrum to what that term means. At most, this was a tactical ceasefire. It wasn't a strategic, permanent ceasefire. I mean, it left the junta in a very difficult position. Basically, it had lost access to Lazio and from most directions. It's the key towns that it took on the road from Mandalay to Lazio, places like Chaokmyo, Nongcho were directly threatened, and its actual control over that main road was diminished. So the junta signed a ceasefire where not only had it lost most of northern Shan, actually it had lost northern Shan except for Musay, but then its positions further south on that kind of key line of the road that goes from Mandalay to Lasha it was left in a very weak position. So overall, though, the junta, this was not a positive outcome for the junta that a ceasefire was signed. The other thing to just say up front is that we have to be realistic. I mean, we can't expect resistance forces to be in full massive offensive mode in perpetuity. This is incredibly difficult to manage. Any military unit is going to take pauses to rest, recovery, regroup, and then also formulate plans for what comes next. So there's a certain cadence to warfare, and that has to be accepted and predicted. So there's always going to be an increase in escalation. There will also be pauses. Eventually, there will also be what we hope will be a complete cessation of warfare. But we have to be realistic, and we can't expect different armed groups that are fighting the junta to be full on continuously. It's unrealistic to expect. The second thing I would note is that say the ceasefire, the connotation that all resistance attacks stopped in northern Shan is inaccurate. I mean, the junta itself has continued to attack in places where the ceasefire has supposed to have been in effect. That's been both violence against civilians, but it's also been attacks on Northern Alliance positions. So the junta has clearly been violating the terms of that ceasefire, which I think people have rightly said is an affront to China, but then also just shows that you can't negotiate with the junta. But the second point is that armed resistance in northern Shan certainly hasn't stopped. I mean, take Kukai Township, for instance. There's been extensive successes there by the KIA since the ceasefire, before the ceasefire as well. and to the point where they've taken over multiple outposts and pushed the junta further out of that township. The other thing is that townships that hadn't been specifically part of 1027 have seen significant fighting since. And specifically, I'm talking about Mabane Township and Momit Township. Uh, these are in the far northwest of Shan State, and we've seen extensive success there, including the taking of towns and the defeat of significant junta units. And then, most significantly, I mean, we have Rakhine. So the AA has massively escalated in Rakhine, but also in Pletwa, in Chin. So we can talk about the ceasefire, but fundamentally the overall trajectory here is still of massive resistance to the junta that is successfully taking territory, both in Shan State, but then also in other places like Chin State and Rakhine State. And then other parts of the country at the same time have seen significant escalation and success as well. In fact, I would say this is what we're still seeing is these rolling waves where the junta is losing territory. I mean, the most significant was the PNLA and its allies taking a town in southern Shan, but we still also have significant resistance attacks across places like northern Magui, Sagain, Kachin itself, where the KIA has been successful at taking junta outposts outside of Pecan Town, and then also in places like Bago and Mon as well. So I think, for people tracking the situation, Operation 1027 was a resounding success for defeating, the pathway to defeating the junta, and should be seen as such. That there was a ceasefire, what I would call a tactical ceasefire, happened, I don't think is particularly significant, especially when we look back on how things unfold. I mean, ceasefires have been a common theme of warfare in Myanmar for decades. Some of them are more significant than others. But I don't see this particular one as being something that's going to last and fix battle lines for the long term. Absolutely not.
So I just want to sort of hone in on the distinction. You made the distinction between what you call a tactical ceasefire and a strategic ceasefire. And I wonder if you can sort of elucidate what the distinction between those is, and specifically, if you can compare and contrast the types of ceasefires that we're seeing or have recently seen within the scope of Operation 1027 with the much more famous National Ceasefire Agreement and the ceasefires, that led to the National Ceasefire Agreement in Myanmar pre-coup.
I mean, I would distinguish them. I mean, there's the term truce, which also can be at a much larger level. There's this term ceasefire. But again, those are fairly ambiguous terms when it comes to what actually happens. I mean, the NCA, in terms of what happened, was in effect something that was meant to specifically lead to extended political negotiations that would set, the parameters for the country for the long term. I mean, I would consider that much, much more significant, strategic in nature, structural in nature, compared to a ceasefire that basically stops fighting, but does not involve any kind of further negotiations on a political level. So we have to distinguish between, what is the purpose of a ceasefire? Is it simply meant to stop fighting, or is it meant to be the basis for extended, longer-term political discussions? And I think, we have to reflect on Myanmar history, which is the junta has always signed ceasefires with armed actors, and then, has this habit of saying that they're going to then lead to some kind of political negotiation or some kind of accommodation with the armed actor. And at times that's translated into groups like the BGFs, the border guard forces. At times, it's translated into ceasefires, for instance, with the KIA.
So you make a distinction between what you call a tactical ceasefire and a strategic ceasefire. And so my question to you is, can you define the difference between those two? And can you then explain what is the purpose and the function of ceasefires that we're seeing during Operation 1027, and how you would compare those to the ceasefires that we saw during the National Ceasefire Agreement and similar ceasefires pre-coup?
Yeah, I think we have to really nuance what we mean by ceasefire, because it can cover a huge spectrum of possibilities. And there's also the word truce, which also has a wide range of possibilities. I mean, on one extreme, we basically have an agreement to stop fighting for either a fixed period of time or an indeterminate period of time, all the way to ceasefires that are focused on allowing for actual political negotiations to come to some kind of longer term political agreement. That would be what I would consider the NCA. This is at a structural level, a strategic level. It's really intended to shape up, to shape the wider political settlement of the whole country. And then conversely, we have these what I would call tactical ceasefires, which are simply meant to stop fighting on the ground. Perhaps they then lead to further discussions about, a more significant ceasefire that allows for political negotiations. I think the 1027 ceasefire is what I would call a tactical ceasefire. I've seen other commentators have also used this term, but it speaks to a basic point, which is that the 1027 ceasefire in northern Shan simply stopped the fighting. In no way was it meant to come to, much larger political arrangements, or start a larger process. Now, the Chinese may, frame it that it's the start of something, but I think everybody accepts that this wasn't the kind of ceasefire that was going to lead to anything more significant than an immediate stop to the fighting. And as I had been mentioning before, I mean, this ceasefire absolutely didn't lead to a stop of fighting in northern Shan, because the junta has repeatedly violated the terms of that ceasefire. But then we've also seen successful attacks on junta forces in Kukai Township, and then also further in the northwest in places like Mongmet and Mabane Township. So in all of this, I think we have to really be careful, as always, with how we use terminology. And then I think also for people who aren't so focused on the ground situation, we have to, we also have to nuance our understanding.
And so, one interesting theme that we have seen with ceasefires, whether this was during the NCA period or indeed, as you yourself mentioned previously, with the current ceasefires during the 1027, the military seems to have a habit of violating their own ceasefire agreements. Now, besides just violating the norms of war, there seems to be a reason that they keep doing this, that there must be some advantage to continually doing this, even though this must surely indicate to all parties, China included, who brokered these most recent ceasefire agreements, that none of these ceasefires will have any lasting power because no agreement signed with the military is reliable. What's the rationale for the military to keep violating their agreements?
I mean, I can't think of any other word. I mean, and force, there's a term and a word. A term would be force of habit, and then a word would be desperation. I mean, the military has been violating ceasefire since, I mean, for decades. These are transactional. The military, I mean, in my own opinion, is the NCA was never a viable peace process, because it was never ever meant to take the military out of its central role in the country's politics, or do anything serious to deal with its authoritarian nature and its economic interests. So I don't think the military is ever had any sincerity in terms of how it approaches ceasefires. Um, and what it does is it uses them basically to supplement its military weaknesses. I mean, the simple truth is that the military doesn't actually win much, if anything. But what it has done over the decades is come to ceasefire agreements. Almost never has it defeated armed opponents. There's very few examples of that. But what it has a long history of doing is signing ceasefires, which then allow it to stabilize the situation in what it considers to its favor, and then it goes from there. But I don't think this fundamentally is not a military that has a wide-ranging history of victory in any sense of that word. I mean, you can just go to the museum in Naypyidaw, and when you go to the little section on victories, I love this section because it's so pathetic. What it talks about is being able to take hilltop forts. This is what the military has been doing for decades. Um, Now, people will say, "What about the Communist Party of Burma, et cetera, et cetera?" I mean, a lot of these they imploded on their own, and you could say the fact that the junta succeeded in forcing a ceasefire and the union didn't fracture. Well, maybe that was victory. I mean, people can try and frame these things however way they want, but fundamentally, ceasefires have always been used one on the ground in a very transactional way to kind of mitigate against the junta's inability to come to an outright victory, and then in a political way to obfuscate, obstruct, stymie any kind of serious political dialogue. And I think right now what we're seeing is that if the junta signs a ceasefire, it's doing so because it's losing. Like I said, the junta lost northern Shan. It came to a ceasefire because it lost northern Shan. It also did so because it perceives the signing of ceasefires as a way to show diplomatically that it's still strong. Now, to anybody who actually follows the situation on the ground, I mean, I'm talking about diplomats here. This in no way was this a ceasefire that showed the junta coming out in a positive way. So I think the junta is continually going to push for ceasefires because it has very little other choice because it is losing militarily. And then it also likes to use it diplomatically to show that it can try and accommodate opposition and that fundamentally it wants political dialogue, which is all nonsense. There's now decades of history of this. And then, I mean, we have the PNLA, which was an NCA signatory, which had a convoy attacked by the military. And then the PNLA decided that despite the NCA, it had no choice but to attack the junta. So, I mean, that's a choice that other NCA signatories are also going to face. Some of that, I hate to say it, but it's kind of pathetic opportunism. Like the junta has been weakened militarily by other people who have been fighting for the duration. But regardless, it speaks to the wider question, which is that the junta doesn't value ceasefires, and there's no significant goodwill towards actually seeing those lead to political accommodation and a fundamentally different type of country.
Hmm. But then, surely then China would have known going into brokering these ceasefires that they were going to fail and that potentially this would be something of a political embarrassment for China, like putting themselves in this position of saying, well, look at us doing our best to broker peace and having that completely collapse within weeks, if not days. What was China's thinking? Did they genuinely believe that this was going to turn the tide, or is China just trying to pretend to be involved without actually having to change the realities on the ground?
I mean, China has a long-standing foreign policy of supporting ceasefires and trying to brokering negotiations, especially on its border. So I don't think this particular ceasefire was significant. It wasn't an outlier in terms of China's wider approach. I think also China, from a strategic perspective, has come to a realization that the junta is weakening, if not collapsing, and that from their perspective, there's also a desire to kind of manage how, or attempt to, you know, put some parameters on how that unfolds. I mean, from their perspective, they probably don't want a quick, massive collapse everywhere, because they'll worry about their infrastructure. Probably what they seek is something that's more gradual. Now, I'm not saying that China's foreign policy is to see the junta defeated, but what I am saying is that China probably, China does worry about the security of its infrastructure, across the country, but particularly in places where there's active conflict, and that it did probably push heavily to have a ceasefire, even if I mean, rationally, I've always thought the Chinese were quite pragmatic, in their own way. I'm not sure they expected this to lead to some kind of wider extended process, at least privately. But what they did want to see is that, that things didn't escalate even further to the point where some of their core interests, became, damaged through the intensification of the fighting. So there's this kind of effort to try and, dampen down some of the intensity of the conflict, to protect their core interests.
Interesting. And so let's look a little bit more broadly, because I know that most of the analysts were pretty nonplussed when the ceasefires were announced. They were not seen as something that's particularly relevant or particularly impactful, whereas to us as a more lay audience, people who are not familiar with strategy, they seem much more significant. So having clarified that element of this, let's look at the broader conflict against the military as it currently stands. You, in your previous interview with us, and a few other experts who've come on, put approximate ballpark estimates on something in the scope of about 6 months for the military to either collapse or be rendered functionally, neutralized. Would you still stand by that estimate?
Uh, I mean, like I said in the last interview, all of us hate to give, you know,
Mm,
even ballpark estimates of what's going to happen. But yes, I still generally stand by that. I think the junta is losing. I think the junta is collapsing. Now, how long that takes, now that's, I mean, I don't have psychic powers. I can't put a precise date on it. But what I've emphasized for the long term, is the overall trajectory of what's happening. And what was very clear before 1027 was that the junta had a negative trajectory. It was not succeeding at collapsing the resistance. Resistance was saturated across large parts of the country and strengthening. And then 1027 happened. The trajectory for the junta, in terms of a positive outcome for the junta, the slope is just, it's become even worse for the junta, and that's been exponential. So overall, this is a military that has, ever worsening options. It's really, I haven't heard from anybody a coherent answer about how the junta actually stabilizes this thing in its favor. I haven't heard one single person tell me that, because right now the trajectory favoring the resistance is clear. And I mean, even people who would push this what I would consider a silly notion that there had been a stalemate for years because they were unwilling to talk about the wider trajectory. Even these people have concluded that the junta faces collapse and defeat. Now they've shifted to talking about doom and gloom about the wider prospects of the country. But the wider narrative here is it has shifted markedly, which is the junta is collapsing, and most likely the junta will be defeated. I think for me, what's also been interesting since 1027 is, again, we have to take it back to more of a military analysis. I mean, I've heard some people say there's this kind of naive assumption that none of this matters because it's still in the periphery. I mean, what constitutes the periphery? I'm not sure, but I mean, there's fighting right outside Naypyidaw and Karenni and Bago, and northern Shan, and then increasingly Mandalay. I mean, there's fighting, down in Mon. I don't know what the periphery is, but anyway, the notion is silly because what it implies is that the junta is still incredibly strong, not feeling significant pressure, and can just continue as is, regardless of whatever happens in these places where we're currently talking about. This is nonsense. What we have to think through is that from a military perspective, what is the actual capacity of the military to still function in the way that it had done previously? And that overall capacity is diminishing markedly. And this is because the junta had placed a huge amount of its combat power in places like northern Shan because it was of such strategic significance to them. We also have to talk about places like Paletwa. I mean, the fact that the AA took Paletwa, people will say, well, who cares about Paletwa? I mean, I'm pretty sure the Indians would say they care. But the reality is that there was a huge amount of investment by the military in keeping Paletwa Township, and the AA still took it. So in all of this, we can't just say, oh, well, these places aren't so important, and the military's capacity, if they lose in northern Shan, it has no significance for what they can do in other parts of the country. This is nonsense, utter nonsense. The junta's overall capacity to function as a military is diminishing. And we can see this very clearly in terms of the fact that the junta was unable to launch any significant counteroffensive in northern Shan. And then likewise, the military has been suffering defeat after defeat in southern Chin, in Rakhine, but then it's also losing in other places. I mean, the fact that the PNLA took the town after just a day or two of fighting, is significant. So overall, the combat power of the military is decreasing everywhere. We have to acknowledge that. By my accounts, the junta is also suffering increasingly, as it has been in places like Sagaing, northern Magway, increasing parts of Mandalay, especially northwest parts of the region, northern parts of the region, and then also in places like eastern Bago. This is a military that is increasingly, it's not on the offensive, it's on the defensive everywhere. And it's also on the defensive increasingly in urban areas. Again, I mean, for me, the fact that the PNLA and its allies took a town within a couple days speaks to the weakness of the military. So I think this thing isn't going to slow down or assume a steady pace, because that's not how military defeat works. It starts to spiral and snowball. I think also for me, I remember they had lost this outpost, and I think it was in Nongcho, outside of Nongcho town, and they showed this picture of all the unit badges from the junta that had been in the outpost. There were, I think there were over a dozen or even 24 different unit patches. This is a military that does not function coherently. It's kludging together what it can to form garrisons and then spreading them out. This is its reality. I mean, in the past week, I've seen reports of the junta using ATR 42 propeller. These are commercial airplanes to push bombs out of them. So in all of this, this is not a military that has a clear pathway to regaining the initiative or even stabilizing things in its favor. This is a military that is collapsing. And so I also want to very specifically push back on this notion that the military is going to pull back into the regions and hunker down, and that'll just all be hunky dory and is completely feasible. I mean, it makes a neat sound piece, but in terms of military logic rationale, it's not as clear as that, because the military, it's like me saying, well, if I chop off your arm and I tell you to go to work tomorrow because it's just an arm, and then why don't at the end of the workday you tell me how you got on with it? It's like, this is what's happening to the military when it loses places like northern Shan. Now it's going to lose Rakhine, likely, then it'll be Karenni, and increasing parts of other areas in the country. The other thing that a term I want to talk about is strategic depth. I mean, the notion that there's a stable part of the country that allows the military to project force into other less stable parts of the country or unstable parts of the country, it doesn't exist. This is a national uprising. There's resistance across the vast parts of the country. About the only part of the country that doesn't have consistent resistance is Irrawaddy region and certain parts of Bago and southern Magui. So the notion that the junta can just retreat into these areas and it'll be able to hold out in perpetuity, at some point you have to push back on this notion, because it's a gross oversimplification of what might happen. Now, there is some possibility for the junta to try and pull back and defend itself. And we see indications of that. I mean, for instance, the junta deliberately, what I would call a coordinated retreat out of police border points on the Bangladesh border, because they knew they couldn't defend those police posts on that border. So there have been places where the military has deliberately pulled back because that they know that they can't defend areas, so they pull them back into bigger garrisons. We will see some of that. But I mean, I would also highlight things like the military had this wonderful idea back in the day to put a lot of their industrial capacity in places like northern and central Magui region. I mean, you have to look at these places where they put their factories. Like, it may have seemed obvious at the time, but times change, and now they're stuck with a lot of their industrial base in places that they increasingly can't defend and are likely to lose.
So you've opened up a lot of directions of conversation here, and one of the things that stands out to me, you did comment on the dissenting voices, basically, and this is part of the reason that we wanted to do this episode in the first place. The majority of the analysts are saying basically the same thing that you're saying. However, there have been a number of posts, whether it's social media posts from Myanmar affiliated talking heads, whether it's articles that have been published online, that are saying things that are much more pessimistic. There is still that undercurrent of voices who are saying, well, no, we need to focus on ceasefires. We need to focus on, integrating the Myanmar military into the new Myanmar state, or are talking about a protracted stalemate or a protracted conflict. The idea that there can be a clear and definitive victory in this conflict is something that certain commentators don't seem to want to embrace. And I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts on why there is this distinction between the commentators and the analysts like yourself who are saying that this is not up for debate? The military will categorically, at some point, lose, versus those people who are just very reluctant to say that that's even on the table.
Well, I mean, I've always pushed back on absolutist notions, and I think the biggest mistake made by I mean, some of these analysts was from the very beginning this notion that the military absolutely cannot be defeated, and that the absolutely only way forward was to have some kind of negotiations that fundamentally accommodated the military. And I would also just say, I mean, at some point you have to question these analysts because they've been wrong about so much from the beginning. I mean, simple things like, would there be a resistance? Would there be armed resistance by the Bamar? Would EAOs work with other EAOs? Would EAOs work with Bamar armed groups? Would there be would the resistance persevere and expand? Would the EAOs on the China border launch a massive offensive? I mean, time and time again, look at the big picture questions, and these same analysts have been wrong again and again. I can't say it enough. So this whole notion, it falls back on this idea that the only way forward is some kind of negotiation that accommodates this military. That is wrong on so many levels. From a simple fact check of reality, it's wrong. From a moral level, it's wrong. I mean, why would anybody expect a population that has been brutalized for decades by a military dictatorship? Why should we perpetually expect them to accommodate that military? And then some of these same analysts are the ones who called out, the violence against the Rohingya rightly as a genocide. I'm sorry, but why do we expect the Myanmar people to accommodate a genocidal military? No, it's immoral. It is wrong. So I would just say, we have to push back on the underlying notion of all of this, which is this. I want to call it an analytical point. It's more of like a philosophical point. It's also driven by ego, which is to say that the junta can't be defeated. By the way, the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi are worse. That also drives a lot of it, and that fundamentally we have to negotiate with the military. So that premise, that argument has been the driving point over and over and over. And I would say that a lot of this, they've desperately been searching through confirmation bias for the last 3 years to show that the military can't be defeated and that it has to be accommodated. I mean, now the big argument will be, well, we have to worry about balkanization and the fracturing of the state and everything else. And I would also, I mean, Scott Marciel, the former ambassador of the U.S. to Myanmar, had a really thoughtful tweet the other day where he said, "Yeah, lots of things can go wrong in terms of trying to create a different country in the future, but one thing is guaranteed, which is the junta is disaster for the country, absolutely, and there's an onus on all of us to help support the creation of a new country that doesn't accommodate a genocidal military." I don't think we have to agonize over that point. Like, this should be clear to people who have some kind of, like, I don't see how this notion of just saying that the military has to be accommodated. I said it last time. How many genocides does it have to commit before we stop pushing the idea that it has to be negotiated with? And certainly, I think that stands for countries that value human rights and democracy. But I think I would also say, for countries that say have a more, aren't so interested in those ideas and notions, and they're worried about balkanization and the rest of it, I would also say, look, the junta is losing. That's clear. The junta cannot control borders to India, Bangladesh, China, increasingly Thailand. Like, the value added for these neighboring countries of engaging with the junta is rapidly collapsing along with its military position. So in all of this, I would say, the idea that fundamentally, absolutely, this military has to be accommodated. I'm sorry, it doesn't. This is not not a line worth pushing. I would also say, I mean, from my perspective, this won't be accepted within the country. Like the Myanmar people are the ones who are ultimately going to determine when this thing stops. Um, and I don't think that includes by saying, oh, we've suffered decades of horrible violence by you. We've succeeded in defeating you to such a significant extent. It's still unfolding. And then suddenly we're going to stop so that we can negotiate with this military that's caused generations of misery for the Myanmar people.
Mm, absolutely. And so let's look then at the actual conflict, because this is, I think these are the roots of misunderstanding. It's not so much that people are looking at this situation and they're looking at the information coming out and they're coming to the conclusion that the analysts are all wrong. I think there are a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings about the realities. And we can go through them in order, but there are questions about, as you know, the centralized or decentralized nature of the conflict, the question as to whether the various ethnic armed organizations are going to potentially swap sides if they think the military can give them a better deal. We know, for example, that the military has post-coup been allied to certain ethnic armed organizations. The question of whether ethnic armed organizations are interested in a nationwide victory against the military or whether they're only interested in establishing strongholds in what they consider to be their own territories. Uh, how how can we approach this? How can we understand this a little bit more usefully and a little bit more accurately? Because the if we take it as a premise and as a fact that the ethnic armed organizations are not loyal to the concept of a decisive victory over the Tatmadaw, then this opens us up to the possibility of, as you brought up recently, the balkanization of Myanmar down the line. How would you explain this dynamic to people?
Well, first off, I didn't say. I mean, my point was that this is an argument that's being made. It's been made for an extended period of time, and it's fundamentally it's this kind of fear mongering to push a notion that, well, we should just negotiate with the military because it could be even worse, and there's a really strong chance that it'll be like the Balkans. And again, these make for nice sound bites and media interviews, but it doesn't sync with reality. Now, I'm not saying everything's going to be milk and honey. There's no country that goes through uh, these massive processes that involve war without there being a wide range of challenges and issues. There will be. It won't be clinically clean. There won't be this magical roadmap that lays everything out and then just gets implemented. I mean, some of this again is what we're expecting is often la la land. I mean, for instance, the idea that after the coup there was immediately going to be a single chain of command, this was also farcical. Um, I think for me, what's happened is that this is a country that's been brutalized by decades of military dictatorship. The country had 10 years trying to accommodate that military through its own constitution. There was a relatively free and fair election with a very clear outcome. Then the junta staged a coup, and then ever since then has been using what I would consider systematic violence against civilian populations. Against that, there arose a national uprising. Now, people can say, well, it's not one movement, or it's fractured, or it's dispersed, or whatever. But the reality here is that none of this would have happened in terms of the military being in its current state if it weren't at a scale that I would consider nationwide. Yes, there are parts of the country where there isn't a significant resistance, but by and large, using that term like this, the faces a nationwide resistance. And I think at some of this, we have to be clear about what was possible. I mean, the resistance from the very beginning was very clear to use this term collective leadership, because nobody thought that there could be a single revolutionary party, or that would be a good thing. And we have to be careful about this notion of single parties that lead revolutions, because they're a double-edged sword. I mean, I've worked a lot on South Sudan. South Sudan had the SPLA, the Sudanese People's Liberation Army. um, And over time, it became originally it was focused on revolution across all of Sudan. Eventually, it ended up focusing on secession by the South after John Garang died, the SPLA leader. But what happened here was that the South Sudan, after independence, has turned into a dictatorship that is as bad or worse than the dictatorship of Bashir, who was the dictator of all of Sudan when they were fighting that war over the 80s and 90s. So in all of this, we have to be careful. Nobody wanted a single revolutionary party. One, because it didn't gel with the Myanmar context. We had long-running insurgencies that never would have agreed to one single leader over everything. That was never pragmatic or likely. It was also unnecessary. What we've had is this notion of collective leadership that, again, in a comparative context, has been remarkably successful. We have to reflect on the fact that we have a country that has had civil war since independence, and then has had military dictatorship for decades, basically where the military has had state power for decades, meaning it's been incredibly entrenched. And now we're at the point 3 years after the coup where the military is facing the possibility of outright defeat. So that was only possible through a collective effort. Now, I wouldn't say that would have been possible through a single effort. That was never on the cards. That was never going to happen. And I don't think it would have been, for a country pushing for federal democracy, I don't think that was ever politically what would have been effective anyway. So from a military perspective, a historical perspective, and then the realities of the current politics, it was never likely or advisable that there was going to be one single commander of the whole show. So I think we have to just push back on that notion, because it doesn't sync with reality. I think we also have to push back on the notion that this is necessary because otherwise we'll have balkanization. I think that's a misframing of it starts to present a false choice, like either you centralize everything or else you fracture. This is a false choice. This doesn't sync with the Myanmar context. Myanmar basically has to go through a rationalization or a reckoning of its political settlement that wasn't adequately sorted after independence. That involves political dialogue across numerous stakeholders. So I mean, I've studied revolution extensively. I've worked in countries that have had single parties that have driven everything, including across ethnic lines. And the challenge is those most often result in dictatorships. So I think in all of this, we have to set expectations, and we also have to get rid of these false choices. What we have now is a wider movement, and I do think it is a movement. I would call it a revolutionary movement that is focused on getting rid of the junta and creating a federal democracy. Now, will that be perfectly clean? No. Will there be issues? Yes. Will there be challenges? More than anybody can ever describe. But this country, more than any other that I can think of in the last 20, 30, 40 years, has a chance to get rid of a horrible, horrible regime once and for all and create a fundamentally different country. That is not going to happen by accommodating this military. It doesn't mean that Myanmar doesn't need a military, but this military doesn't need to be part of the country's future. The second thing in all of this is that, we have to acknowledge that EAOs have been very clear about what they're looking for, and they've been fighting to achieve that for decades. I think everybody has to acknowledge the sacrifice and perseverance of these EAOs, that have been fighting for so long. This precedes the coup. We have to give a lot of credit to that. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that the key factor that is shaping what's happened since the coup and what will happen in the future is that we now have a resistance against military rule that includes the Bamar majority plus ethnic minority groups. That's a historic change. That's incredibly important. People can say, well, what about the Burma, the Communist Party of Burma, et cetera, et cetera. There's some truth to that, but that was for a fairly narrow amount of time, way back in the 50s or so. Then that insurgent group became much more segregated between leadership and its armed components. Anyway, my point is that in all of this, this notion that there was going to be one single chain of command, and that if there wasn't, the only possible outcome is the country fractures. It's not that simple. This is just what I would consider very simplistic fear mongering. What I would say is that there are real risks that face Myanmar should the junta fall. This is inevitable. As I said, no country goes through these processes without having bad things happen, there will probably be further violence, there will be bad incidents, there will be some bad blood. We don't know what will happen. But what we do know is that having a genocidal military still involved in the country, and this horrible notion that only this genocidal military can keep the country together, we need to move on. Like the country, we need to give the benefit of the doubt to all of these resistance groups fighting against the military, that they can create a better future. I would also say that the notion that there is no chain of command also needs qualification. I mean, we have to give credit that there has been a huge amount of coordination, communication between EAOs and the NUG, and then also within the NUG. I mean, I've worked in countries where we've had massive amounts of intercommunal violence during the course of war, and we don't see that in Myanmar. Like, I'm sorry, people throw this out there. It's completely inaccurate, especially from a comparative sense. Like, Sagaing has not erupted into intercommunal violence. It just hasn't. What we see overall is that there is a massive amount of public goodwill for getting rid of the junta and creating a different country that is a federal democracy. Now, different groups have different understandings of what that term means. That's natural. That's what has to be negotiated. That will also take time. We can't front load all of these incredibly complex, sensitive political negotiations before the fact, which is the defeat of the junta. Like, I always give people the example of the American Revolution. Like, we didn't have a constitution before the end of the war. We also have incredibly mythologized the notion that George Washington was in command of everything. I mean, read any history of the American Revolution, and there is an incredible amount of resistance actors doing what they thought they had to do. But ultimately, it panned out. So my point here isn't that everything will be milk and honey, is that we have to give the benefit of the doubt to a revolutionary movement that intends to get rid of the junta and create a different future for the country. And so the last thing I would also point is this notion that what's happening now is just a continuation of what has always happened. I mean, it's just total nonsense. This idea that, well, there's all these different groups and they don't care about anybody else, they just care about themselves. I mean, some of this is silly because some of these international actors have also said, well, forget about everybody else, just focus on your local administration. Sign a long-term ceasefire with the junta, forget about the rest of the country. So, I mean, some of these international policy prescriptions have also been incredibly toxic. But then at the same time, people push this notion that without the junta, it's just going to balkanize. So, in all of this, I think there's an onus on us to give the resistance the benefit of the doubt that there is a wider movement to create a different country that doesn't involve a genocidal military. And for me, probably one of the things that makes me most optimistic about that is that, I mean, when you look at other countries, one of their big issues is that they have certain individuals who have been involved for decades and they're driving everything. And this is a revolutionary movement that has had an incredibly important nonviolent component to it. That's not just the CDM, it includes the wider participation of local communities, it includes the diaspora, it includes the activist networks, but it also includes the CDM, the civil servant boycotts or strikes, but plus the public boycotts on things like taxes. So that's been incredibly important. But then also we have this massive involvement of the youth. I don't think we can understate the importance of the youth to what is happening in Myanmar, and that entirely new generations, most of which came of age during the transition years, and they saw that a different type of country could be possible. And they were absolutely unwilling to accept a return to military dictatorship. That we can't just write that off as like, oh, none of this matters. It's just a continuation of what had already happened. I mean, this is cynical to the extreme, and it's just grossly unfair to a population that has suffered endless atrocities by the junta and received, very little tangible support in what is a very just cause to get rid of that genocidal military. So, I mean, sometimes I get so frustrated with just the rank cynicism of some of this analysis. Um, and it's like the Myanmar people can't win. They have a federal democracy charter. They have a human rights ministry in the NUG. They have collaboration between Bamar groups and EAOs. Like they have codes of conduct. They have all of this, and then none of this. It's like impossible for this to be acknowledged. It's just everything has to be this doom and gloom, and then all these I would call them goalposts. I'm an American, that's what we say, these continually shifting the goalposts. Like before we would say, oh, it doesn't matter because the resistance doesn't control towns. Oh, nothing matters because there's no unit level defections. Oh, nothing matters because there's no surrendering of military units. Nothing matters because the junta can't control territory, and on and on and on. So it's like all of these things are happening, and then you just get this rank negativity. This is a comment that's aimed more about the Myanmar people. Um, my suggestion is don't let it rile you up too much. I mean, this is a revolution that you own. Fundamentally, it will be decided domestically. Um, like, it would be nice if there were more international support, but whatever happens, fundamentally, it will be because of what Myanmar people do to choose and set their own future. So I think we have to acknowledge that, and not get too riled up by some of this really simplistic, sensationalized analysis that just always points to argue that Myanmar is basically a lost cause, and that it's nothing good can happen there unless the international actors kind of save the Myanmar people from themselves. I mean, all of this is just so weird. So I think that's what I guess that's how, just the overarching points.
And I mean, we appreciate that analysis, and not to question or disagree with it, but I do want to come back and clarify this, specifically when it comes to the ethnic armed organizations. Are you saying that you do not envisage a situation in which the EAOs, having pushed the military out of the territories that they associate themselves with, where their associated the ethnic group is dominant and their language is dominant, would basically delineate a new border, and while still notionally supporting the revolution, would not venture beyond that? Like, not to go so as extreme as to say, well, would we see Kachin and Shan ethnic organizations besieging Naypyidaw? But do you envisage the possibility that they would come up to the border of the territories that they have historically claimed and say, well, we've secured this territory now, our job is done, someone else will continue the revolution elsewhere?
Well, I think overall it'll be a mixed. I mean, in all of this, we have to nuance it. I mean, what we've already seen is that EAOs like the KIA, the KNU, uh, have been very willing to work with Bamar PDFs, directly engaged with the NUG. So have the Karenni, the Chin, um, and that and then there's also, even aside from direct military cooperation that existed before 1027, even before that, there was support by other EAOs for the resistance that came in different forms. But I think this notion, I mean, I've always pushed back on this notion that basically EAOs don't care about anything else and they all just want to create a WA state. Like, I just like, maybe a couple EAOs think like that, but I don't think just saying everybody just wants to be like the WA, I don't think that's accurate. Like, it's much more nuanced than that. Um, so my perspective is that we have, and I said last time that I really hate this term EAO because it leads to overgeneralization and grossly simplistic observations. Like, my perspective is that we have to nuance the intense interests, actions of different ethnic armed organizations in terms of how they engage with the wider goal of ousting the junta and creating a different type of country. Now, I don't think the MNDAA has ever said that they're going to march on Naypyidaw. So I think we have to be clear that, certain EOs are going to focus on what they've said they were going to do for decades, which is they do want to create a, a different kind of political reality, a different kind of social reality for parts of the country that they consider to be areas of their interest. There's nothing outlandish about that. They've been very consistent. I mean, they've been talking about it for decades. At the same time, since the coup, they've also been clear about saying nothing in this country can change unless we get rid of the junta. And that, I think, a lot of these EOs, also through the failed NCA process, which is just going to increase as other groups like the PNLA also say, what's the point of continuing to engage with a collapsing junta, is that fundamentally we have to get rid of the junta and then negotiate a different kind of country. So I think within that wider political context, I would say, when it comes to groups like the KNU, the Karenni, be it the KMPP or the KNDF, the IEC, or now we have the Chin, which are putting together a Chin state government. We have the KIA, KPIC. We have a whole range. And then on the other side, we do have groups like the MNDAA that have been very clear that they are much more focused on their immediate area. We also have the AA, which has been very clear about what they're looking for. So I think saying there's one answer for all EAOs is not accurate. We have to nuance the wider situation here. What I think is true overall is that everybody wants to get rid of the junta. Plus, I think we have to say there is a genuine wider discussion about coming to a new political settlement that involves federal democracy, i.e., is fundamentally is about a different type of political arrangement, i.e., federal and democratic. Now, what federal means is always going to be open to discussion. There's actually no technical measurement for federalism. It's a political understanding. So if that's federal, confederal, whatever, that has to be negotiated in the future. What I don't think is I don't buy into these arguments that EAOs will just take the area that they want to control and then do nothing further, because there's no logic to that. I mean, what is the point of the AA taking Rakhine State and then being next to a country that's left in a toxic state of war for the next decade or two? It makes no sense. It's the same with groups on the Chinese border. What's the point of having war across the Bamar heartland uh, in terms of your own viability, in terms of economic growth, political stability, social development, et cetera, et cetera? Like, it's in nobody's interest to have a large part of the country that remains at war. It's illogical, and that's very clear. So I think my argument in all of this is that we have to nuance the conversation. We also have to be pragmatic. I think we also have to reflect on the reality that the NUG has invested steadily, consistently, extensively in developing PDFs, in developing chain of command, and doing so in partnership with EAOs. That they work together as part of a wider collaboration to get rid of the junta, especially the Kachin, Chin, Kearney, and Karen. So I think we have to acknowledge that that's been going on since the coup. And then in terms of the Northern Alliance, I think from a we still deserve to give them the benefit of the doubt about their political intentions. In their public statements, in their, be it verbal or written, they have been very clear that they do want a different country to emerge, and that they do want a different type of political arrangement, and that they're not outright secessionists. So I think we need to get some of this is they're just tropes that are thrown out there. People latch onto them because they can kind of be summarized into a sentence. um, Now there are this again is not to say everything is going to be milk and honey. There will be tensions. There will be disputes. There will be times when people feel like this side or that side isn't doing enough. To be honest, that happened before the coup as well. I mean, for decades, there was resentment amongst ethnic minority communities that the Bamar weren't fighting, and that after the coup, there was this really weird idea that the EAOs would group together and they would fight the junta and everything would work out wonderfully. It's like, I'm sorry, like that was never going to happen. Like either the Bamar start fighting as well, or the EAOs aren't going to collaborate, work together with them. But what we have is a clear demonstration that the Bamar are willing to fight, have been fighting, and have been doing so successfully, and that's going to escalate further. So what I'm saying here is that a lot of these kind of these tropes that are based on saying, well, it's just a continuation of history, and these are all completely disparate, scattered armed groups that don't care about anybody else. It's not true. It's not accurate. It's certainly not accurate if that's the generalization for everything, everybody, everywhere. We need to nuance it. And I would say the overarching trend here is that there is a military dictatorship that is being actively defeated, and that is only happening because it involves the Bamar majority working together with ethnic minorities. Whatever good comes next will also only happen because of that. So I think that's something that we have to acknowledge. The other thing I would say is from a geopolitical perspective is that what is unfolding now also, like say, take the Chinese. What exactly is the point of China being interested in a situation in Myanmar where you have one armed group, the AA that controls one side of their pipelines, and then the China border controlled by another group, and then you have just never-ending war in the middle. So I think in all of this, even if you strip it aside of the morality and ethics of the matter, which is very clear, i.e., getting rid of a genocidal military, there's a certain pragmatism to see the junta ousted and some kind of wider political settlement agreed upon, and one that keeps Myanmar together as a whole, albeit with a significant amount of autonomy, as has long been uh, uh, discussed and was actually the founding discussion for the country going back to Pangloss, etc.
Hmm. So then, all right, let's look at the actual the flip side here. We're talking about the various groups. I know you don't like the term EAO, so let's the various revolutionary groups. But on the other side of the line, we've had a number of organizations. Obviously, the Border Guard Force is a very good example of this. But there have been a number of armed organizations that did, at the least a year or 2 years ago, align themselves to the military. Has there been any particular change on that front? Have we seen these groups fleeing the sinking ship? Are they abandoning their alliances with the Central Military Command, or do they continue to notionally work alongside the military?
I mean, I would say, we've seen border guard forces, kicked out of the country, defeated outright, scattered. Certainly the Kokon is the most striking example. We've seen border guard forces like Karenni ones, which just changed sides as units. That happened quite a while ago. And then now we have, the Sao Chitu border guard force and Shui Koko saying, at least officially they're no longer affiliated with the junta, they won't take salaries, etc. I think we have to be clear that a lot of these actors, I would call them, these were very transactional relationships. These were, we sign a ceasefire with you and we carry on with our business activities, and that's a win-win for both of us, including to the point where the military has become exceptionally involved in these scam cities like existed up in Kokon areas, but then also in the Mewati area down on the Thai border. And so I would say, in terms of these types of arrangements, I don't really see them as, sincere, extensive, long-term political understandings. These are transactional business deals. Now, that also is a little bit of an overgeneralization, but I would say, if you nuance all of these points, that what we have is a junta that has very few sincere allies, and that's a key point that we have now. In all of this, who are the BGFs, the large militias that have a structural significance, that are still on the side of the junta, i.e., willing to fight? Even the PNO in Southern Shan is probably reassessing its position right now, because being a direct military partner of the junta is a losing proposition. So on all of this, as I said, these are overwhelmingly transactional arrangements, which were premised on, we have a ceasefire, the junta doesn't attack us, the junta is still more or less the national power and can guarantee us some kind of certitude about what's going to happen in the future, as well as some protection. All of that is collapsing. What we have instead is a military that is collapsing, and that its value added as a partner is rapidly declining. Now that's true not just for the border guard forces, but also for neighboring countries. When the junta can't even access the border, its value added to neighboring countries, it just starts to implode. And I think that's also true with some of these other actors. So to the specific question, I think you were getting at was like, some of these groups did come to arrangements. I would say the question is like, was there any wider political significance to that? And was that political significance of a type that would lead to some kind of political arrangement that would allow the junta to stabilize the wider situation in its favor? And to that, I would say no. even groups that have kind of been fence sitting, like the New Mon State Party, like this, the value, the conspicuous value of fence sitting is rapidly collapsing because the junta just doesn't have anything to offer. And then in all of this, you have the wider public sentiment, which is we want to get rid of this military once and for all. So I think that there are reasons. There is a history here, which is, I mean, one thing that the junta is good at, like I said, it's not winning militarily outright; it's coming to ceasefire arrangements. So there is a history of that. Like I said, there's. I mean, this is what the military considers victory, and it's always been to the detriment of the country. Um, but I don't see that as something that's going to be an increasing trend because there's just this straight up reality that the military just has less and less to offer in terms of ceasefire partners, and that's both from. I mean, that's across multiple angles. It doesn't have much to offer in terms of military guarantees. It doesn't have much to offer in terms of political guarantees or access. And then most important, I would say, is also it's the economic benefit of such arrangements is also decreasing because the military is losing control.
So then that I think brings us back to a very important question, probably the most important topic, and that is how do we come by the information that we have? Because the analysts overwhelmingly agree. We've had a slew of guests come on, providing us with information that comes from either the industrial perspective or the strategic perspective, the economic perspective. But one of the big questions is how do we understand what we understand? We have people making statements about the amount of aircraft that the military have, the number of bases that they still have, estimates on troop sizes. For example, a US IP published an article, which we discussed the other day, estimating that the genuine size of the military is only at about 150,000 men, which is a very very low estimate. With the military having said for years and years and years that they had a troop size of about 400,000. So we're talking about a number that's almost a third of the military's reported figures. We've got maps that show bases, like military bases, and yet we've got people saying like, yes, there's a military base there, but we're not worried about it because the Damodar are basically besieged in that base. They can't move anywhere. They can't go anywhere. In a conflict this complicated, in a conflict this murky, where we don't really have CNN on the ground wearing bulletproof vests giving us direct footage. We don't have reporters getting interviews from people. We don't have all of the advanced apparatus of a Western military information system. How do we actually know the situation that the military is in? How do we know the tide of war? How can we make these predictions?
I mean, I would take it back to the beginning. I mean, I remember being in Yangon immediately after the coup, and there were a lot of, again, these very absolutist articles that said, I think the figure at the beginning was between 350 to 400,000, and X 27th biggest military in the world. I forget the number, but there were these kind of. I mean, I remember one article in particular. I don't want to name it because I don't want to get into a tiff with people, but I think there's always been these single sentence notions. Oh, the military can't be defeated; it's too powerful. It's like, well, this is an utterly moronic statement. Like any military can be defeated. I was, it's like saying, listening to somebody from the U.S. and say the U.S. military can't be defeated, and you're like, well, let's talk about the last 20 years of history. Like maybe you weren't defeated outright, but you certainly didn't win. So in all of this, I would say, we start these kind of single sentence summaries get established, and then they kind of get accepted as absolute facts. and then there's very little willingness to then nuance it as the situation unfolds. What we've had, I mean, the military at the time of the coup very well could have had 350,000 personnel. Now, out of those 350,000 personnel, you have to accept that, probably upwards of a third to 40% or even more are just support staff, service staff. In terms of actual combat staff, it would be, significantly less than the total number. And then the other thing is we have to talk about, the actual coherence and capacity of that military to function. And this is where I think one of the biggest challenges for the military has been that after the coup, it had to start fighting a war that over decades it had lost focus on or hadn't prepared for, which was it had to fight in multiple ethnic minority areas against long established EAOs, including ones that were exponentially stronger because they had collaborated with wider parts of the population, like in Karenni and Chin. But then the military was also having to fight across vast swaths of the middle of the country. Specifically, I'm talking about Sagaing and Magway, especially northern Magway, where they just weren't prepared. I mean, if you look at a map of formal military installations, I mean, Sagaing historically, in terms of its infrastructure from the last 20, 30 years, I mean, Sagaing was basically a transshipment point for logistics, staging to do operation in other parts of the country. For instance, Chen and Kachin. So the raw reality that the military faced after the coup was something that it was not prepared for. I mean, we also see this in terms of things like the military had absolutely no ability to move large numbers of troops across, vast swaths that are Sagaing in armored transport. They also didn't have enough helicopters to move troops when they were facing daily IED attacks and ambushes. I mean, overall, what I'm implying here is that, we've had a military that has really struggled to deal with a reality that it wasn't prepared for because it never thought that the Bamar majority would partner with ethnic armed organizations and wider ethnic minority communities to push for the outright ouster of the military. So my point in all of this is that the analysis of what the military is, what it is capable of doing, what kind of fight it has to fight, and what tools it has available has always been incredibly, if not oversimplified, just outright wrong. This is not a conventional binary civil war. It never will be. So this is, from day one, has been a bottom-up national uprising that spans the population. And that's the type of war that is difficult for any military to fight. But it's particularly difficult to fight for a military like the one in Myanmar because it just wasn't focused on that. I mean, this is, and I think this is where some of the analyses that I found more persuasive are these notions that, over the 90s, 2000s, this military really lost track of its overall purpose because it shifted heavily towards its economic interests. Now, it still retained quite significant combat power, especially in terms of LIDs, an air force that could focus on one or two theaters at a time. And I'm really talking here about the ability of the military to fight the KIA extensively, but then also fight the AA. That's what I would consider the kind of the high point of the military's combat capacity back in around 2018, 2019. Now, go back to 2022, 2023, where the military now has to fight across, by my count, in any one month, the military has to fight in at least 60%, usually 65% or more of the country's townships. That's incredibly difficult to do. And I mean, for instance, take Sagaing. I've heard some of these really farcical ideas, like there was only one LID in Sagaing. I mean, give me a break. This is a military that's been kludging together units since at least the end of the dry season of 2022. So basically, this is a military that's been vastly stretched out and forced to never had enough manpower for the task at hand. Now, how do we know that? I mean, we just have to look at what's unfolding. I mean, this is a military that hasn't been able to launch any counteroffensives in Shan. Every week is losing more towns, and even people who have said the military hasn't, can't be defeated, can fight in multiple theaters, have conceded that in places like Sagaing, the junta had already lost control of a large majority of the rural population. So in all of this, the military has just been incapable of uh, kind of reformulating its force posture in a way to deal with the post-coup reality. I mean, I would also say a significant thing in all of this is, we have to look at proxy indicators of military capacity. And I mean, for me, the biggest indicator, and it's not even a proxy, it's a direct indicator of military capacity, which is, can they mount serious counteroffensives anywhere? Could they do it in northern Shan? Can they do it in Rakhine? The answer so far has been no. What they're doing is trying to keep what they still have, defend what they still have, and then committing mass violence against civilians. I think that's also an overarching point in terms of military analysis. We've had this idea since the beginning, and this is something that really grates me, because a lot of people who talk about the strength of the military talk about it in purely military terms, as if the civilian atrocities are just kind of something that happens on the side. And I think we have to be very clear that completely ingrained, integrated into not just the culture, but the doctrine of this military is systematic violence against civilians. This is arguably the biggest tool that the junta uses. It's not successful at attacking other military forces. What it's successful at is attacking civilian populations and forcing ceasefires. That's what it's been doing. Now, there's some variation in that. Obviously, I mean, we can talk about, Karen areas in the 1990s. We can talk about, other parts of the country. But I've always said, anytime somebody wants to talk to you about the military capacity of the Myanmar military, and they don't talk to you about the extreme use of violence against civilians, just tell them they're full of nonsense. Like, you can't separate these two. And this also speaks to the actual military capacity of the Myanmar military, which is that, through their ideology, doctrine, indoctrination, etc. They've been willing to use violence against civilians since the beginning, and that's only escalated over the years. So in all of this, I'm going off on a little bit of a side tangent, but I think it's fundamental to the point, which is, you can't talk about military power without talking about military violence against civilians. And we see this right now. They've been bombing the town in southern Shan that the PNLA took yesterday, the day before. I mean, it's the same in Rakhine. Rakhine has extreme amounts of violence against civilians right now because the junta is losing in Rakhine. It's the same in Sagaing. We had over 800,000 IDPs in Sagaing. The biggest misconception about Sagaing is that these 800,000 IDPs happened because of violence between armed groups. It happened because of junta violence against civilians. That was a junta strategy. So let me get to the point of how strong is the military, what capacity does it retain, and what does that kind of portend for what might unfold next? I mean, in terms of capacity, we have to reflect on what is happening to the military, which it is conspicuously losing. It is losing towns, it is losing outposts, it is losing massive fortifications. I mean, for me, Paletwa is worth examining. Paletwa was not just an outpost here, an outpost there, a base here, a road there. Paletwa was like an insanely fortified, militarized position that had been held by the junta for decades, and had been constructed to be this kind of, this place that could never be taken by any type of resistance, but it fell. So my point in all of this is, like, there is a conspicuous erosion of military strength, and that, for me, one of the biggest indicators of that is that the violence against civilians is escalating. I mean, I track the atrocity violence against civilians. It's gone up massively in the last couple of months in terms of air attacks on civilian populations, as well as artillery shelling of populations. At the same time, though, we see rural parts of the country that have seen fewer ground raids because the military just doesn't have the ability to project into parts of the country. For instance, parts of Sagaing, have been relatively more quiet in rural areas because the military can't do these types of ground raids that they were able to do in earlier months. The other thing that I would say is that the fighting is becoming increasingly urban. Now, no military wants to fight a war that's urban. Urban fighting is the worst kind of fighting. It's very difficult. It's just it's a bad situation. Militaries like freedom of movement. They like to maneuver. They like to use multiple types of weapon systems. They like to do coordinated attacks. Urban warfare is just difficult on all those counts. And so the question here is, this is a war that is increasingly focused on taking towns, and that's a clear sign that the junta is losing, and that's a trend that is still continuing. Every week there are more towns that are lost. I mean, the other thing that I would highlight is that the junta, once it loses territory, it's not taking it back. I mean, this is what I've talked last time we did an interview, and I made the point that there's a certain threshold that has been crossed, whereby if the junta doesn't actively defend an area, it will lose it. We've also passed a threshold where when the junta does lose something, it's not going to get it back. Like, if anybody, I remember some of these conversations about, the junta is going to launch these big offensives and retake these towns in northern Shan, and it was all nonsense. Because if you actually looked at the wider military situation, it wasn't going to happen, because the military is already spread too thin in too many parts, fighting too many local battles. So the whole notion that the junta has this strategic depth where it has all these large intact units that it can maneuver to retake territory, this just speaks to the point that the junta has been hollowed out. Now, that didn't happen just because of 1027. That was a process that had already been happening over the preceding 18, 20, 24 months. This was a military that was fighting in areas where it just never had the manpower, even at its height, to deploy large numbers of troops. And again, I give Sagaing as the example of that. The junta cannot fight in Rakhine, Northern Shan, Karen, Mon, Tanatri, Eastern Bago, and then deploy massive numbers of troops across Sagaing and Magui. So, these are the fact that once the junta loses territory, it's lost. The fact that if the junta doesn't defend territory, it's going to be lost. This all speaks to the weakness of the military. I mean, then we also have some of these more conspicuous things, like the junta doing forced conscription down in Bago, Irrawaddy, Yangon, or trying to chain gang youth in Yangon City, or putting up false advertisements to try and get them to join the military. I mean, this is desperation. There's no other word for it. There's also the question of the Pusati. I mean, one thing that I will also say about, when we reflect on whatever happens in the future, which is that the Pusati never never transpired into what they were intended, which was a popular militia force that was able to spread out and prevent the emergence of resistance, or at least to keep it relatively tamped down. And the Pew Sortie has had a significance that I would consider notable in certain townships. I'm especially thinking of places like Convolou and Sagaing Township. But the ability of the military to kind of generate larger units to compensate for its initial size or to compensate for its combat losses, it's just never had that capacity. So what it's had is what it has, and that's just been decreasing. And if you're a military strategist, I think one of their biggest issues is very stark, which is they had this military. They then were confronted with a national uprising spread not just in existing EAO areas, but across wider areas like all of Karenni State, all of Chin State, and then across places like Sagaing. And they just haven't been able to create the forces necessary to respond to that reality. And so this is a question that also comes to a head, because if you're a military planner sitting in Naypyidaw, one of your questions now is, I have all these dispersed forces, mostly in small units. We're talking not even, at best, they're still a full battalion or in name, but in reality, they're more like a half of a battalion in terms of actual manpower. But a lot of these places, they're even smaller groupings, and they're spread out everywhere. And so this is also at a point in the war where we have to talk about logistics. And I mean, it's a bit mundane, but at the end of the day, any war eventually comes down to a question of logistics, resupply, rearmament. I mean, that's certainly the conversation that's going on about Ukraine, but it's also true in Myanmar. The question in Myanmar is, how does the junta resupply so many different units spread out in so many different places that are faced with daily attacks and the outright possibility that those locations might be overrun? I mean, I read the daily reports about the conflict situation, and I mean, they're using helicopters to drop supplies into Loika. Loika, I mean, it's true also places like Hakka. They've used helicopters to drop ammo and troops into townships immediately outside of Monua and Sagaing, like Budalan and Ayada. So in all of these places, there's a question about how much manpower, ammunition does the junta have available to carry on. Now, I'm not saying the junta is going to collapse tomorrow or next week. I've said that for me, there's a plausible argument that the junta could collapse in the next 3 to 6 months. I made that argument a month or two ago, a couple months. So we'll see what happens. Like, I'd be the first to admit when I'm wrong. But what we have here is a junta that's dispersed, spread too thin, but also has incredibly diminishing capacity to reinforce, resupply, rearm so many dispersed small units that are facing, and it's a bit academic, but I would call it envelopment, which is, i.e., at risk of being overrun. And if you're a military planner in Naypyidaw, the question is, what do you do about it? And from my perspective, there's not a lot you can do about it, because they simply don't have control over the roads. They don't have enough transport helicopters. They don't have the support of the population for a lot of to move large amounts of equipment and material. And so this is a real question facing the junta now. And I think this was also a question, for instance, in what happened in Paletwa, and in other areas, is that the junta just doesn't have the capacity to resupply so many disparate positions and so much of the country. And so in some of these places, it's also a question, it's an open question of how long these junta positions can hold out, given their available manpower and ammunition, as well as their basic rations. And I think that's something, it's hard to assess, but it's something that is of strategic significance as 2024 really gets going.
So I want to thank you for coming on and discussing these things, because my hope, our hope here is that with episodes like this one, what we can start to do is not just to inform people about the general conflict, but inform people about the mechanics underlying the conflict, and therefore put them in a better position to be able to evaluate when there's different information coming from different sources, information that may seem conflicting, to be able to evaluate, well, which of these sources is more likely to be true, which of these sources is using argumentation and evidence that is in line with our understanding of the Myanmar conflict, and not having to rely on a more generalized understanding of past conflicts like Vietnam, like World War II, conflicts that are deep in the cultural zeitgeist but are not relevant. So I sincerely hope that we've done something to help chip away at the knowledge gap. But before we end, you may remember from the last interview that we did, we always like to end with some final thoughts from our guests, just something to put into the minds of our audience as they go on about their day after the episode. So if there is anything that you would like to express, or any thoughts on this topic, or Myanmar more broadly, that you think people should consider, I'd like to invite you to share that now.
Well, just one other, I think one of the, I just forgot to mention it. I mean, in the wider context of Myanmar's history, certainly in terms of its military history and this notion that the military can't be defeated, I would also say, I mean, one thing that the military has always pushed, as have the proponents of the idea that it can't be defeated, is its ability to sign what I would consider, strategic long-term ceasefires. And I've already made the argument that I don't think the 1027 ceasefire was strategic or long term. I think it's short term and tactical. But I would say, probably one of the biggest signs of failure of the junta since the coup. Well, there's two main ones. One, the junta has never ever been able to build up political support in the Bamar majority. It just hasn't happened. The junta has never stabilized uh, popular support, much less grown it in terms of the Bamar population. Second is the junta has not signed these strategic long-term ceasefires with any new groups. So in the past, this was always what the military would say: "Oh, we've been winning and achieving success, and we haven't been defeated, not because we actually got rid of our armed opponents, but because we came to a long-term ceasefire with them." And what we're seeing now is the actual collapse of that. The PNLA, the BGFs saying, "Well, actually, we don't want to be involved with the junta at all anymore because they see the writing on the wall that the junta is collapsing, and it's very, very plausible that it will be defeated outright." I think in all of this, my final comment would be, the Myanmar people should take heart. Like, this has been your revolution. You have been the ones who have pushed it. You've succeeded more than any other country has in the last 20, 30 years when confronted with a deeply entrenched genocidal military, i.e., one that is willing to use mass violence against the population. All of this has been through the determination and dedication of the Myanmar people. And again, fundamentally, I've never been a proponent of the idea that the Myanmar situation was going to be resolved through international action. I've always been a proponent that this was going to be a revolutionary war, win or lose, that would be determined inside the country by Myanmar actors. Now, things are still going to unfold. Again, I'm not psychic. I don't know everything that's going to happen, but I maintain my point about the wider trajectory of the war, which is that the junta is losing, it is collapsing, and fundamentally that doesn't mean just in so-called peripheral areas, but across the country. And so 2024 will be a difficult year because as the junta loses, it will use more and more violence against civilians. It doesn't have the military capacity to fight or willingness to fight just against armed opponents. It will increasingly just target civilians. It's done that for decades. It'll keep doing that. It'll do it more. So I think it's important, for the Myanmar people to focus on what's happening now and to maintain faith that they can create a better country and that it will be their country. And to be honest, out of all of this, they'll probably be better off for it if they can push towards outright defeat of the military and then have the types of political negotiation that is required for a stable long-term political settlement. And I think that's something that the Myanmar people have to own and really be dogmatic about owning it and be proud of what they've achieved so far, because it really is historic, both within the country, but also from an international comparative angle. So that would just be a final point.
For whatever reason, even as the conflict in Myanmar continues to worsen, it somehow continues to be shut out of the Western media news cycle. And even when the foreign media does report on the conflict, it's often presented as a reductionist, simplistic caricature that inhibits a more thorough understanding of the situation. In contrast, our podcast platform endeavors to portray a much more authentic, detailed, and dynamic reality of the country and its people, one that nurtures deeper understanding and nuanced appreciation. Not only do we ensure that a broad cross-section of ideas and perspectives from Burmese guests regularly appear on our platform, but we also try to bring in foreign experts, scholars, and allies who can share from their experience as well. But we can't continue to produce at this consistency and at the level of quality we aim for without your help. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda ba yaranam no